Greetings everyone, one and all, welcome once more. As always, I am your most humble host, Jay. I return once more from the void between pages to again tell of the bizarre and the unknown. So sit and relax as I again share with you what I've been reading. You know, I realized something last episode, and it's that I've been neglecting Marvel's content. It's not fair to me to have done so, and it sets a bad precedent for me. After all, if I focus all on one company's content, people will start to think that I'm biased, and that will affect the perception people have of me and my critiques. Anyways, time to talk about more DC stuff. Okay, all jokes aside, this time we're not strictly talking about DC, as we're going to be talking about 1976's Superman vs. The Amazing Spider-Man. Published in March of 1976, Superman vs. Spider-Man is a landmark story in the history of superhero comics, featuring the very first time two rival companies joined together to publish a collaborative work between their characters. Meaning that, yes, this book is, in fact, responsible for basically every single shitty crossover event from now until the end of time. Written by Jerry Conway, with art by Ross Andru, by which I mean him and about 5 other people were doing it, the concept of the story is rather quite simple. After ending up in prison together, Lex Luthor and Dr. Octopus decide to join forces to take out Superman and Spider-Man. Now, the origin behind the actual creation of the book is detailed in an editorial column at the start of the book, but the short version goes like this. In the 1970s, author and literary agent David Obst pitched to DC and Marvel a collaborative project between the two featuring Superman and Spider-Man. Then editors Carmine Infantino and Stan Lee, who had worked together in their younger years and had a pre-established friendship, agreed to the idea, and the pitch eventually took the form of the comic we have here today. It's pretty interesting how simple it all started, to be perfectly honest, that the entire thing was just an idle suggestion by someone who just so happened to know the two people who could make it work, and that those two people just so happened to already be friendly enough to actually put effort into making it an actual production. These series of coincidences isn't really something that you can get these days, especially with the ever-growing complexities of the endlessly tangled monopolies of media giants. Now, first thing to discuss in any crossover is, what is the inciting incident? What series of events occur to put our two heroes from separate worlds and separate companies together in the same place at the same time? Well, there isn't one. Not really, at least. See, this story, rather interestingly, considering how things would be with this essentially every other crossover afterwards, there's no big setup to the actual crossing over of events. Superman and Spider-Man just so happen to coexist together in the same world at the same time, and for all we're supposed to know, they always have. And that's basically it. There's no magical transportation, no drug-induced hallucinations, no overly convoluted story about cosmic entities battling it out. We just happen to be looking at a world that Supes and Spidey live in together at the same time. And sure, in hindsight it might seem rather lazy, but there's honestly something refreshing about how simple it is. As if they knew even back then that no one really gave a shit why the characters were teaming up, they're just here to see their favorite characters beat people up. As for how our two heroes meet, that's another story. The first third of the hefty 90-page issue focuses on the initial setup, with Superman and Spidey stopping otherwise unrelated schemes by Luthor and Doc Ock and throwing them in jail. Luthor stomping through Metropolis in a giant robot so he can steal a tiny little computer chip, which serves as something of a MacGuffin for the story, which honestly feels like a waste of time and resources for him, and is pretty much just him asking for Superman to show up and kick his ass. And the sequence isn't terribly interesting, but it's a nice standard Superman story. I like how the robot has all these anti-Superman defenses built into it, and is ultimately defeated by Supes outsmarting the weaknesses, which is exactly what Luthor wanted to do, giving him an easy escape. But then it gets dragged out further to a fight in a giant underwater robot base thing Luthor has, and it feels a bit unnecessary, especially where the two scenes are interrupted by Clark returning to work for like one page, getting yelled at for ignoring the story about the giant robot, then immediately going back to it. I think it would have flowed better if the underwater part was melded into the giant robot stuff, and the scene at work is put at the end of that. Weirdly, Spidey's segment follows the exact same beats as this, but comes out much better in the process. Speaking of, Spidey's segment is a bit simpler, as he just so happens to catch Doc Ock in the process of robbing a museum for no real good reason while he shows off a giant flying octopus robot he built. Yes, it is exactly as ridiculous as it sounds, and no, it never shows up again after this intro. Again, despite being the exact same beat-wise and having less relevance to the overarching plot, I find this segment to be the more enjoyable one. Perhaps it's just because I find the workplace hijinks and life drama of Spider-Man more interesting than Superman? Maybe so, but I think that's a problem with the story overall. Spider-Man is the far more interesting of the two characters here, leaving Superman to be particularly dull. And not that I don't find Superman interesting, I've said it enough times that in a great writer's hand, Superman can be an incredibly interesting character. I think the issue here is that Conway has far more experience and understanding of Spider-Man and his personality than he does Superman. So it leads to a Spidey who feels fully fleshed out and realized, and a Superman who, while not badly written in any way, feels rather stock and doesn't particularly bring out a whole lot new to the Man of Steel. This also extends to our villainous duo as well, as Luthor feels like a pretty stock villain, less of a character and more a series of villainous bullet points, whereas Ock has a pretty clearly defined personality and feels more like an actual character with some level of depth to him. The main crux of the story, the actual crossover part, involves Luthor and Doc Ock, after getting arrested and just so conveniently getting put in neighboring cells in prison, deciding to team up and take out Superman and Spidey basically just for the hell of it. Neither of them have any specific goal in mind, at least not immediately. We just have two villains saying, hey, you know what? Superheroes fucking suck. Let's team up and kick both of our heroes' asses. Again, it's super simple, and while I don't deny in a modern context it feels lazy, I honestly appreciate the earnestness and bluntness of it. They know what we're here for and aren't going to waste our time with some hackneyed plot about some unnecessary elaborate doomsday plot or what have you. And I like how the actual meeting goes down. Luthor only just barely knowing who Doc Ock is just such a natural Luthor thing, and Ock's annoyance at it makes it better. The meetup and subsequent escape is a bit too quick, but at the same time I do like how it cuts to the chase. Luthor slapping together some special gadget he had hidden in some ultra ridiculous secret hiding spot is another really fun Bronze Age Luthor moment. The actual meetup of our heroes occurs when Peter and Clark, who've been invited to some big news conference because plot, end up crossing paths after a duplicate of Superman shows up and kidnaps Lois and MJ. Again, the actual why of it isn't particularly important, largely owing on the coincidence of a shared profession between the two heroes, and we go from them arriving to the kidnapping to meeting in about 10 pages. I do appreciate that the shared coincidence of Peter and Clark both being reporters is used here. It would have been weird if they ignored it. And there's a fun moment where Peter and Lois meet and they actually recognize each other and are familiar with each other's works. It's a tiny little bit of world building that's appreciated, and it gives Peter a small victory for his self-esteem, which is always appreciated. This is where the story gets a bit confusing to someone reading it later on who isn't familiar with the story of the two titles at the time, so I'll explain the title a little bit. Now, I'll fully admit I'm more well-versed in Spidey's storyline at the time of this crossover than Superman's, so going into it the stuff with Clark and his job is a little odd to me. Basically, at this point in time, the Daily Planet had been bought out by media mogul Morgan Edge, owner and CEO of Galaxy Communications, who rebranded the company, which led to Clark becoming a TV anchor for some time as well. Post-Crisis, Edge would become leader of Intergang, a criminal organization that served Darkseid, but pre-Crisis he was just some asshole businessman. Now this doesn't really have any bearing on the story as a whole, but there's an ongoing subplot about Edge trying to fire Clark and replace him with Walter Cronkite, because it was the 1970s and that would have been a big deal. But it's just one of a list of topical continuity notes that come up. On the other hand, Spidey's current status quo has more of a bearing on the story. It's mentioned a few times throughout the story, but at this point in time in the comics, Spider-Man is currently a wanted fugitive, evading the cops due to being branded an outlaw. The reason for this goes back to Amazing Spider-Man number 121 and 122, which featured the, at the time, final battle with the Green Goblin, and both the deaths of Norman and Gwen Stacy. Due to a series of unfortunate coincidences, and Spidey being a self-deprecating sad sack, their deaths are pinned on him, making Spidey a wanted criminal and overall killing his reputation even further than it had already been killed. Spidey's bad reputation ends up leading to the main event of the book, the obligatory pre-team-up hero fight. Surprisingly, it doesn't take up a whole lot of time, only lasting for about 10 of the 90 total pages. Naturally, in order for the fight to be anywhere close to even, Spidey gets an off-screen assist from Lex and Doc Ock, being blasted by some doodad that gives Spidey red sun radiation or some shit so he can punch Superman. It's really not that important. It's overall a fun fight in terms of nonsensical misunderstanding superhero fights. It's handled pretty well. Both heroes have a reasonable motive for starting the fight. Spidey because he just saw what was by all accounts Superman kidnapping Mary Jane and Lois, And Superman, since he already knows Spidey by his negative reputation, assumes that he's involved with it somehow. Even then, Superman quickly realizes that there's a misunderstanding and tries to solve things without a fight. Unfortunately for him, Spider-Man is particularly pissed off today and doesn't really want to listen. I do like this idea. Usually these big team-up fights will have the heroes spend a dozen or so pages fighting, only to learn that they're on the same side basically on a coincidence. And having Superman come to the conclusion at the start is nice to see. It also lets Superman come out looking like the bigger man by having him not actively trying to fight, while Spidey's basically throwing a tantrum. And even with the power boost, Spidey would be giving Superman a run for his money, but here he's totally bodying him for most of the fight. It lends a nice balance to the two, and I like the addition that Spider-Man being too thick-headed to listen to him starts to genuinely piss off Superman, to the point where he loses his cool and actually begins to fight back. Only to realize at the last second that, hey, you know what, I know this spider guy shouldn't be this powerful normally, and if I hit him with this, I'm going to turn him into paste. I think we need to pull things back here. It's a nice little humanizing moment for Superman, and serves as a nice ending to the fight. That and Spider-Man's power boost wearing off, causing him to break all of his fingers trying to hit Superman. The last parts of this book after this is a bit of a mess though. When Supes and Spidey put their differences aside, we then have like 15 pages of kind of pointless padding, with them following the trail of Lex and Ock to a secret base, which is totally pointless since they weren't actually there, then traveling to Mount Kilimanjaro in a completely irrelevant segue with some African tribesmen, which goes nowhere, until we get to Superman and Spider-Man making their way into space, where Lex and Ock are hiding out in the Injustice Gang's old headquarters. It just feels like unnecessary padding, and while it has some fun banter with Supes and Spidey, it's pretty much pointless. Anyways, we finally find out what Lex's end goal here was, using the little doodad he stole at the start to hijack some fancy new weather satellite, and he begins to use it to fuck with the weather all across the world to ransom the government for a bunch of money. I mean, look, it's not like Lex really needs a reason more complex than this to hijack some fancy weather satellite, but his overall end goal being just, I'm going to hijack the thing to get bribe money, makes Doc Ock's role here pretty pointless. Not that Ock being here wasn't pointless already, but when the primary goal was, let's just team up and beat up good guys at the start, at least he's contributing something here. Now it just feels like he has no reason to be here besides Lex offering to pay him. Then we get to the big final dog pile fight with everyone, and it's fine. There's nothing particularly interesting about it that's worth talking about. I like how the fight is in zero-G, it's about the only part of the space setting that's utilized at all. And we get the equally obligatory villain switcheroo, which is kind of fun, but is ultimately pretty standard. There's no real advantage taken with the swap, since the zero-G environment puts Spidey at a disadvantage, and Superman got stunned before the fight started, so there's no challenge for Doc Ock. I do like how they end up beating Lex and Ock by having Lex just go fuck it and switching to just trying to destroy the Earth instead. Ock deciding that he needs to stop Lex since, hey, I live on Earth too. Without an Earth, where am I going to put all my stolen crap? And the story ends on this really great set piece of Superman flying down to stop a giant tsunami from destroying the East Coast, and the way the narrator describes it is really quite interesting. And so the day is saved. Superman and Spider-Man defeat Lex Luthor and Dr. Octopus, the weather satellite is out of their control, and everyone gets to go home happy. There's a fun little epilogue where Clark and Peter reunite with everyone, both conveniently having footage of their fight from earlier to appease their pissed off bosses. And I like the little bit where Clark and Peter meet face to face and make a joke about how the two of them were just so conveniently nowhere nearby when everything went down, huh? So all in all, how does Superman vs. Spider-Man hold up? How does it compare to its successors? Fairly well, I would say. While it's not the absolute best big intercompany crossover I've ever read, it's pretty enjoyable and certainly nowhere close to being the worst. The art holds up well, and while none of it particularly stands out for the time period, every big spread and every major set piece is wonderfully crafted, and really does a great job at setting the scene. The story isn't all that exciting. It's a pretty run-of-the-mill team-up excuse plot that mostly just feels like it's trying to fill space from scene to scene, and you can see a lot of the issues that affect pretty much every later crossover come up here. We don't really have any good reason for why Lex or Doc Ock team up, and nothing about this plot really gives any good reason for why Superman or Spider-Man need to work together, other than their respective girlfriends getting kidnapped because evil. But I like that there's very little time spent on the obligatory misunderstandings plot, and Supes and Spidey fit surprisingly well together. Although I wish there was more done with their shared backgrounds. Really, I think the biggest problem with the story is the length. A lot of points feel like Conway is just looking to fill space in the story, and with 90 pages to work with, I can't exactly blame him. You can tell that by the end, he starts to get a better grasp on Superman and Lex, and I find that pretty interesting. It makes me want to track down his Superman stuff and see what it's like. And his take on Spidey is, as always, top-notch. I'm sure back then this felt like the last big hurrah for his run to people. At the end of the day, it's just another standard crossover event, but being the first of its kind makes it worth checking out. Knowing that this is responsible for so many shitty team-up books over the years makes it a particularly strange thing to look back on, but as its own thing, it's a serviceable read. I would recommend you keep an eye out for a copy if you ever happen to be looking IRL. A decent quality copy can easily net you a few $100 if you're careful with it. Moving on, we've got a lesser-known work, 1997's Major Bummer. The topic of creator rights and ownership of creations has been a very long-running topic in the world of comic books for nearly the entire existence of the medium. Comic writers and artists have fought long and hard for the right to take ownership of what they create and fight back against the exploitative nature of the entertainment industry, and it's a very interesting topic to discuss. Today we're not having that discussion though, at least not entirely. Both Marvel and DC have had hundreds of works published under their names, but owned entirely by the creative team, and one such title is today's topic, Major Bummer. Major Bummer, written by John Arcudi and illustrated by Doug Monk, better known as the duo behind The Mask, was a 15-issue series created by the duo and published by DC, and tells the tale of poor Lou Martin, a good-for-nothing slacker with a dead-end job and no prospects in life beyond finding what's next on TV, who finds himself transformed into a bona fide superhero overnight. Blessed with the power to protect the peace and change the world, Lou sets out on the path to stay at home watching TV and avoid being a superhero as hard as he possibly can. Wait a second, that doesn't sound right. Yes, as you probably figured out, Major Bummer is a comedic parody of superheroes, poking fun at the overall nature of the genre and tackling how sometimes great power doesn't necessarily mean great responsibility. Let's start off by going over our hero, Lou. Based on the synopsis, it's pretty easy to get a feel for his character pretty quickly. He's a lazy, self-centered idiot who only cares about himself and wants nothing to do with the story at all. And in any other context, he'd be a terribly unlikable character, but he's rather endearing to a certain degree. Sure, his refusal to be a hero isn't any deeper than he doesn't give a shit and would rather do anything else, but he's not whiny or obnoxious about it. He's understandably justified in his ambivalence, and his powers and the heroic shenanigans that follow him constantly ruining his life only serves to make things worse for him. And I like that aspect of the series. Most superhero parodies that I've seen don't seem to touch on the aspect that actually being a superhero and living the life of one would suck shit because the universe just hates you specifically and things are constantly showing up to try and kill you. The fact that this series takes it literally, in that Lou's powers, granted by an alien device that showed up at his house by complete accident, are designed to quite literally create danger for him to face by drawing in other people with superpowers. And it's also a neat touch, but it doesn't get brought up too much over the course of the series, and honestly it feels like they forgot about that aspect after the first few issues. But Lou is a man of simple pleasures, and him getting forced into superpowered nonsense at every turn serves as a fun narrative device. His powers aren't particularly interesting, generic super strength and invulnerability mostly, but I like that he has super intelligence, and he has the ability to pretty much create miracles of super science from random crap lying around, but since he's normally so dense and preoccupied on himself, he's not able to consciously use it unless he really tries hard to. And it's used well, and it's a fun gimmick to have. I'm a sucker for the can't use the power willingly or consciously trope, I mean hell, look at Psychoblast, and I wish it got used more. The rest of the cast is pretty boring though. There's the other heroes that Lou is forced to put up with, and they're mostly one-note gimmicks. There's Gecko, who can climb on walls, and literally nothing else, who takes being a hero way too seriously. And he's fine, he can be pretty funny, and I like how his overall naivety gets him into trouble, but he doesn't have a whole lot else to him. Lauren, an elderly psychic who can see the future but keeps getting sidetracked by random tangents and telling stories about her life, is honestly a bit annoying. The joke gets old fast, and she never really does much important until the last few issues when she suddenly becomes super important to the series. And I honestly just kind of speed through her lines whenever she starts talking, because the rambling just goes on forever. Francis is the one I like the most, mostly because things actually happen with him. Looking like Elric if he had bulimia, and having a sonic scream laser blast thing, he also takes being a hero way too seriously, but unlike Gecko, there's actually more to him. He quickly develops a rivalry with Lou, who he hates because he refuses to be a hero and wastes their time with his whining instead of helping them, and is hated by Lou because Francis is a douchey hippie with a massive ego problem. Their rivalry is fun because it's really just petty and childish, which is how most superhero rivalries tend to be. And his ego trip throughout the series is fun, him quickly cashing in on his fame for money only for it to dry up almost immediately, forcing him to crawl back to where he was a fun arc, and it makes him doubling down on his pettiness all that much funnier. Lastly there's Val, a rich girl who can fly, and nothing else, who's not bad per se, but is just kind of dull. They keep bringing up her being some kind of environmentalist weirdo, but it never really actually matters in any way. And they set up a thing about her having the hots for Lou, but it never really goes anywhere significant. The villains as well don't have much to talk about either. The closest thing we have to main villains are Zinnik and Yuf, the aliens who created the devices that gave Lou and everybody else their powers. A duo of college students who created the devices and gave everyone powers as part of a thesis statement. They're not necessarily evil, they're just incompetent. I mean, sure, they're responsible for literally everything that happens in the series, either directly or indirectly, but that doesn't mean they're any good at it. I love the idea behind this, two schlubby aliens who accidentally set off a world-changing event by fucking around for college credit. Sadly, it doesn't get utilized to its fullest, as they mostly take a backseat after the first few issues, but they do still stay around and get involved in the plots. They're mostly secondary figures in them, though. Well, I should say Yuf is, because Zinnik gets mulched a few issues in and spends the rest of the series as a disembodied head, slowly becoming madder and madder as time goes on. But Yuf I do at least find fun. I enjoy the similarities he has with Lou. They're both kind of goofy slackers who don't really care about the grander narrative and are focused on their own problems. And they're not even really enemies, they just don't like each other very much. And both for good reasons, they're just both kind of dicks to each other overall. Our other primary villains are a local gang of incompetent crooks who Yuf gives powers to in an attempt to get back at Lou. Most of whom aren't all that interesting, and I'm pretty sure that they don't even say half of their names at any point. None of them really do or say anything particularly funny, and while a few of them have some good bits, I think the guy who's so smart that he's entirely unintelligible consistently got a chuckle out of me. The idea of a comedy villain team doesn't get utilized too much since other than their first issue, they mostly just spend their time bumming around and bickering with each other. I like the parallel that the villains are equally as incompetent and ambivalent towards each other as the heroes, but there's not much it gets used for. They have fun powers, but they don't get much chance to use them in any significant degree after their debut. Their more or less leader, Nunzio, is the only one who had much of an impact on things, going from being a wimpy pushover and kind of a joke to becoming a giant, hulking, brutish monster, immediately going on a power trip to get his revenge against his allies, which naturally leads to them not really giving much of a shit when he gets his ass beat, then arrested, then his ass beat again, and then killed. Other threats our valiant hero has to deal with includes gross alien worms, overzealous fanboys too dense to take a hint, a demonic toddler, and a giant Nazi Tyrannosaurus Rex. Yes, you did hear that correctly. A giant Nazi Tyrannosaurus Rex. I'm going to be entirely honest, this thing showing up kept me reading until the very end, because let's face it, you throw in Nazi dinosaurs and clearly whatever you've got going on is worth my attention. I think the series' satire of the superhero genre is pretty on point. There's a relatively short arc where Lou starts to get fame for being a hero, despite not actually ever doing anything heroic, which ends up ruining his life by causing him to get followed by the media and leading to an obnoxious, obsessive fanboy pushing himself onto Lou to try and force him to be a proper hero, as well as being why Lou's fame catches on to begin with. The fame leads Lou to immediately cash in on what little fame he has, selling out faster than he can say sold. And there's some fun jokes about Lou getting screwed over by contractual nonsense, as well as his now former fanboy turning on his hero for becoming a sellout and going commercial. A nice little dig at a certain demographic of comic nerds who complain when things get too popular and therefore they don't like them anymore but still consume their products and obsess over the characters. Hey, wait a second. And I like how, as mentioned at the start, they play with the idea of being a constant source for superpowered weirdness makes it basically impossible for Lou to have any kind of real job, leading to him basically going broke and nearly getting evicted over the course of the series, and making him essentially unhireable in the process. Gekko also gets a short arc near the end where, after saving a kid from getting hit by a car, the kid's parents understandably get upset when they see a stranger in a gimp suit carrying their child, leading to him getting arrested and going to court. All of which leads to Gekko having an epiphany that he totally does not actually learn anything from. But overall, a lot of the jokes don't really land for me. There's certainly a lot of great moments, and Arcudi and Monk really have their comedic timing down well, but a lot of the jokes either didn't get much of a reaction out of me or just fell flat. I wouldn't say any were forced, or that it was overall unfunny, but your mileage may vary here. The last few issues switches to a rather serious story arc, although not too serious, involving some asshole alien dicking around with the time machine, leading to a spiraling trail of destruction in time-space. The tonal shift is pretty interesting. Lou interacting with his time-displaced counterparts is fun, and I like how future Lou is just kind of jaded and has gotten used to having to deal with the superhero shenanigans. And there's a surprisingly deep moment where future Lou goes on a big rant to present Lou about how much of a fuck-up and a waste of space he is and how much he regrets being him, which is honestly pretty interesting and comes off almost as a pseudo-criticism of the series itself. Of course, it wouldn't be right to end it with Lou actually learning anything and not changing in any way, which is perfectly fine. I wouldn't want it to end any other way. It's a pretty solid arc, honestly, and it's a shame that this is what it ended off with, since if the rest of the series was on the same level, I think it would have caught on. Ultimately, Major Bummer ended with issue 15. The book was cancelled, this much it surprisingly acknowledges right on the cover itself, as sales simply weren't high enough for DC to keep it going, a fact that Tomasi is shockingly blunt about in the letter columns of the last issue, and Arcudi and Monk were either unable or unwilling to pick it up and bring it elsewhere. It's a bit disappointing, since you can tell that they have a lot of ideas for what they wanted to do with it, and based on the letters pages it did have a dedicated following, but sadly it just wasn't enough. Arcudi and Monk would later bring the title over to Dark Horse to republish the original run in a trade paperback, but nothing further was ever done with it. Overall, I wasn't too impressed with Major Bummer. I thought the fight scenes were really neat, they utilized Lou's cowardice well, and it leads to some fun hijinks with him trying to flee from danger. And the art is spectacular. You can really tell Monk learned a lot from the mask with the exaggerated facial expressions, and there's a lot of little detail in the environments that adds a great touch, although I'm not too big of a fan of some of the gross out stuff it does. Thankfully it's pretty few and far between. But a lot of the cast just isn't very interesting to me, and as a comedy superhero satire it falls flat. It's a bit of a disappointment since I came into this expecting more. Everyone I've seen bring this up has always given it high praise and speaks fondly of it, but I simply walked away rather ambivalent. Maybe it was the high expectations I went in with it that soured me, or maybe it's because I'm reading it for the first time nowadays when there's been way more superhero satire in the years since, and I've just seen what it brings to the table done already. Not even necessarily better, mind you, just seen it done before. I do quite like the more unorthodox approach with the character actively fighting against the nature of the series he's in, but a lot of those elements aren't used to their fullest. I would definitely give it a recommendation if you're a fan of The Mask or Arcudi's other works. If you enjoy his humor, then you'll certainly enjoy this. Otherwise, there's not a whole lot I can recommend with this series. But if you got like an hour to kill, then it's a short enough read to plow through, and you might end up finding something about it that I missed. As well, keep an eye out for the trade if you ever go into a comic store or bookstore. It's long out of print and goes for some crazy prices based on what I've seen, so you might get yourself lucky. And on that note, I believe that's all for this time. This has been Jay, and as I return to the void between pages, I look forward to when next we may meet, and I can share what else I've been reading.